Welcome. I'm so glad to see you all. I'm glad the rain didn't dissuade you from coming. I'm Mark Robbins. I'm president of the American Academy in Rome, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the first in this year's conversation series. The conversations from the American Academy in Rome, as many of you know, was started last year, and it's a way for us as an institution to talk about the work that done by scholars and artists after they come back from the academy. There's the amazing gift. The gift first happens to the fellows who get to spend a year or 2 years in Rome, but then the gift to the rest of us is that we have artists and scholars who produce work in concert halls, in galleries, in museums, in universities for 10, 20, 50 years. And that's the gift that, as they used to say, the gift that keeps on giving from the American Academy. Last year, we started our series with Francine prose. So we're now moving to poetry from Francine. And so I've been thinking about language, and in part because I've been at the Academy now for a year and a half, and as some of you know, I'm trying to learn Italian, which is a mixed blessing. And so you think about translation, you think about meaning, and you think about the kind of embeddedness of meaning in the words that we use. And then I think about how this has an impact on the way we think about poetry. And I lived with English majors when I was in college. And I remember one of my pals came in very, very excited. And he came in with this textbook. And it was, How Does a Poem Mean? And so I said, no, Jeffrey, it's what a poem means, not how. And of course, Jeffrey was very pleased to tell me, no, here's the book. It's how a poem means. And it suggested that the poem, rather than being explained in terms of a narrative, had to be experienced. And in looking at the author of this book now is John Chardy. This book was written in 1959. He was also an Academy fellow. He was at the American Academy in Rome in 56, 57. So there is this strong lineage and strong connection. And so thinking about this question about meaning, about significance, and how we interpret a poem or how we approach language in this condensed form, luckily I don't have to answer that question, and that brings me to tonight's speakers. The onus is on them, and I'm delighted to welcome Robert Polito and Ed Hirsch to join us tonight. Ed Hirsch was a fellow at the American Academy in Rome in 1989 and is also the president of the Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation and a widely celebrated poet. He's published 9 books of poetry, including 2010's The Living Fire, New and Selected Poems. And I became aware of Ed and his connection to the American Academy in Rome in a remarkable profile a couple of summers ago in The New Yorker, and we met after that and talked about poetry, about the Academy. And I think it was at that point that I said, if we ever did anything on poetry, would you be willing? And in fact, you said yes, and you've showed up, which is great. So thank you for that. Robert Polito is a poet and an academic and a critic, and he's known for drawing source material from American pop culture as well as literary traditions. And we both share an interest in the shadier aspects of film noir and Hollywood genre as material for kind of more serious analysis and representation. Between 2013 and 2015, Robert was the head of the Poetry Foundation, which was based in Chicago, and that's where we met, and we were having a series of conversations about the relationship or an ongoing relationship between poets and poetry and the American Academy in Rome, which has an august tradition, and we were thinking about ways in which that might be enhanced. Robert has returned to New York, back to the New School, where he used to be the director of the writing program. He did that for 11 years and is now a professor at the New School. And he's written books which include a guide to James Merrill's The Changing Light and Savage Art, and most recently, Hollywood and God, which sounds great. I like this. I also want to recognize our hosts for this evening, the New School, and thank you, Dan, for your work in technology. It helps. And this is part of a series of collaborations that the Academy is entering into last year with the Morgan Library and with the Museum of Arts and Design. We'll hopefully be at the Menil in Houston, as well as doing a project with San Francisco MoMA through this conversation series when this goes national this year. Just another brief word on this evening. Our poets will read from their work and then have a conversation about poetry, maybe addressing what or how a poem means, or not. He's saying or not. And then I'll come back up and there'll be a chance to open up for questions to the audience. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome Robert Polito and Ed Hirsch to come and speak. Who's going to speak first? Robert Polito.
So thank you very much, Mark, and I'd like to thank you and thank all of your staff, Sean Miller particularly, who I've been corresponding with. And it's an incredible pleasure to be reading here tonight with Ed Hirsch, a poet and a thinker about poetry that I admire so deeply. And it's also just great to be back at the New School and have this be the occasion of my first reading at the New School. I'm going to read 3 poems. They all, and this wasn't initially intentional, they all have a kind of European theme. And in fact, the first poem that I'm going to read has a little moment at the end that's set in Rome at the Villa Borghese, as a matter of fact. And it's the poem that you referred to. It's the title poem of my collection, Hollywood and God. Hollywood and God. If only God would save me, I would know how to hurt you. If only God would save me, I would know who to sell my soul to. Anything is an autobiography, but this is a conversation. William Burroughs insisted literature lagged 50 years behind painting, thinking no doubt about abstraction, collage, fragmentation, his cut-ups. But whatever that meant, why always 50 years? Or however he presumed to rile other writers, poetry probably does lag behind any credible media theory about it. So that if I put a pine tree into a poem, a grove of pine trees and beyond them the sea, you'd think it was the same tree Wordsworth put there, instead of 2 obligatory centuries of nature studies, all those technicolor vistas, torch songs, couples drifting through leaves and Salem commercials. Into one life and out another, the way a junkie playing a writer playing a priest, so that when I finally blurted out, "You betrayed me, I wounded you, we're so unhappy," you assumed the burden of personal urgency. Supposed it was me speaking at the limits of my self-control, and not the damn don't cry, temptation, and leave her to heaven. You open your mouth, and a tradition dribbles out. But that's mimesis, how almost impossible to avoid mimesis. Anybody's hardest truths prompting the most fractured constructions. The way to think about God might be to disobey God, if only God's wish to remain hidden. So that if everything is an autobiography, this is a conversion. As my lives flash before me, why must the yearning for God trump all other yearnings? You often hear converts confess the drinking, his pills, her sexual addiction, concealed inside them a yearning for God. But why not the other way around? The admission of Jesus into your life, concealing instead the wish, say a need, to be fucked senseless, drunk, drugged, and screaming, oh God, on a hotel bed. God embraces our yearnings. That afternoon, my father heard his diagnosis of inoperable cancer. My Aunt Barbara demanded we get him to Lourdes. She demanded this with a glass of vodka in her hand. She demanded this running her fingers up and down my leg. She demanded this before she passed out in her car. In the movie of my life, my father died after I forgave him. And when my secret tormentor said, may the ghosts of your dreams gnaw at your belly like a wolf under your jacket, did she really want revenge, or was she just killing time? For me, God is a hair shirt, or he's nothing. For me, God is a pain in the ass. That's mimesis again. This hour, I tell you things in confidence. I might not tell everybody, but I'll tell you. The world is a road under the wall to the church. The world is a church, and the world is a road, and the world is a stone wall. Still, he wanted her the way the cardinal wanted the Caravaggio. And when the ill-advised possessor of the painting resisted, one night papal guards searched his house. Of course, contraband came to light, some illegal rifles. And when the ill-advised possessor of the painting went to prison, the cardinal got his Caravaggio. But I wasn't a cardinal, nephew to the Pope. And you were not a Caravaggio. So I asked you to be in my movie. So two recent poems I'll finish with. This is a poem about our cats, but it's also about a moment when one of our cats discovered the difference between film images and what was right in front of her. And it references some of the earliest cave paintings and also the great early films of the Lumiere brothers, Auguste and Louis Lumiere, and Auguste's daughter, André. And it's titled Maya, after the name of one of our cats, and she was named in turn after the filmmaker Maya Deren. Maya. All of our cats have since died, but back when two were alive. Maya drifts past the TV on the way to the kitchen and stops. Her eyes registering, that's quick random motion up there. That's a cat on the screen. That's a cat I know. That's Lisa. The backstory, ultimately, is trivial. Testing out a borrowed camera, Christine filmed Lisa eating and played it back to confirm everything worked. Trivial, I mean, compared to, for in psycho-historical terms, this is the discovery of representation. Maya circling behind the familiar luminous rectangle where no Lisa. Running to the food bowl, no Lisa. Then back to the TV and Lisa. The tyranny of representation, CLR James tagged it. But not so much the bold shaman caves of El Castillo or Chauvet, with their ochre oryx, horses, and human hands. As André Lumiere on her high chair in 1895, when Auguste hands her a biscuit she appears to try to give to someone just beyond the frame. That's Uncle Louis operating the cinematograph. André Lumiere, who would grow up to assist her father's medical research and die during the influenza pandemic of 1918. People who love animals used to love people, Howard Moss tagged it, as Maya starts again for the kitchen, starts to eat. So the last poem that I'll read, it's from a series of poems that are rooted in Plutarch's essays, not the great Greek and Roman biographies, but the essays known as the Moralia. And the Moralia they're really worth looking at. I mean, they're the first collaged essays that I know. And each one of the poems takes its title from Plutarch. This is called Sayings of Spartan Women. And it's in 5 short sections, and the opening line of each section is a direct quotation, albeit in translation, from Plutarch. Sayings of Spartan Women, after Plutarch. 1. On her husband Leonidas' departure for Thermopylae, while urging him to show himself worthy of Sparta, she asked what she should do. He said, marry a good man and bear good children. I'm better at controlling my environment than my behavior. I like saying things like I'm better at controlling my environment than my behavior, as though I'm announcing something decisive and not just saying no and yes at the same time. I'm the smartest person in almost any room I walk into, and I pretend to be the craziest. I've gotten smooth at intimating I'm lots of things. The blonde, a housewife, my daughter's buddy mom, your neighbor with devastatingly shrewd advice and a pill for every occasion. Peel away my pretending, and what you got? That's a good question. My husband treats me like one of his trauma cases. I like it that my husband treats me like one of his trauma cases. It's what I love most about him, that he doesn't judge and sees how lucky he is. 2. Someone contacted a Spartan woman to ask if she would agree to let him seduce her. She said, when I was a child, I learned to obey my father, and I did so. Then, when I became a woman, I obeyed my husband. So if this man is making me a proper proposal, let him put it to my husband first. Whenever we're talking on the phone into the night and I hear my husband downstairs returning late after his shift, I whisper that we must hang up right away. I say, I should look asleep or my husband will want to have sex with me. I like telling him my husband will want to have sex with me. So he'll have the image of me in bed inside his head and the nights I don't pretend to be asleep. It's so painful wanting something I can't have. I like writing him it's so painful wanting something I can't have, when I know he'll reply, of course I can have it anytime I want, if I really want it. Ordinarily, I hide my face under a pillow, but last Sunday was wild and free, accidental ambient sex. My husband so grateful, surprised, I thought he'd cry. But he must have known I wasn't there in our bed with him. 3. Certainly when someone asked what gain the laws of Lycurgus had brought Sparta, he said, contempt for pleasure. Mornings, I head out for slow, punishing runs through the hills above my house to relax. Almost everything I do to relax. Yoga, Pinot Grigio, pot, running no matter what until I burn all over, talking and talking, even blowing Adderall every once in a while up my nose. People think of me here as a wife, the wife of a saint who denies he's a saint, but my husband tells them I'm the saintliest person he knows. I like it that my closest friends are secretly crazy, and they bring their secrets to me, like I'm their priest or a private pharmacy. My father threw up in front of the guests at his 50th birthday party. Everyone enjoys his company, though you could probably call him an alcoholic. No, you can't. You've no right, but I can. 4. Another Spartan woman, as she was handing her son his shield and giving him some encouragement, said, either with this or on this. I'm a terrible liar, so his number is in my phone under the name of an old roommate I never call anymore. That way, anyone who looks will think I'm back in touch with her. I like saying things like I'm a terrible liar, for the suggestion of reluctant but ultimate morality, and a hint those words could themselves be a lie. So my family knows we talk, but not how much, or that we meet for lunch when I go into town, but not what we do after. That way, I'm not saying anything that isn't true, as if I'm on the witness stand or a stealth mission. My mother taught me to sacrifice my happiness for others. Even then, I saw there's power in that, and you can tilt the game so sometimes you get a lot of what you want. But I won't do anything, or nearly anything, to shame my daughter. A friend accused me of loving the drama more than I wanted him. But what was her point? That he wanted me more than he loved the drama? 5. On noticing a house in Asia rooted with square beams, the Spartan asked the owner whether timber grew square in that area. When told no, it grew round, he said, "What then? If it were square, would you make it round?" I'm better at controlling my environment than my behavior. I like saying things like I'm better at controlling my environment than my behavior, and not just yes and no at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Ed Hirsch.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Those poems are spooky. Plus, I learned something. Hey, honey, want to have some accidental ambient sex tonight? I don't know how that's going to go down. Anyway, terrific reading. Very glad to be with you. My year at the Academy meant so much to me. I really had a remarkable experience. I didn't really want to be influenced by being in Rome, but I was influenced by being in Rome anyway. To poetry. Don't desert me just because I stayed up last night watching The Lost Weekend. I know I've spent too much time praising your naked body to strangers and gossiping about lovers you betrayed. I've stalked you in foreign cities and followed your far-flung movements, pretending I could describe you. Forgive me for getting jacked on coffee and obsessing over your features year after jittery year. I'm sorry for handing you a line and typing you on a screen, but don't let me suffer in silence. Does anyone still invoke the muse, string a wooden lyre for Apollo, or try to saddle up Pegasus? Winged horse, heavenly god or goddess, indifferent entity, secret code, stored magic, pleasance and half wonder. Hell, I've loved you my entire life without even knowing what you are or how. Please help me to find you. This is called Black Rhinoceros. The black rhinoceros at Brookfield Zoo, eating sweet potatoes, carrots, and bread, looked like my uncle's extended family crowding around the table at Thanksgiving. Mrs. Mulvihill suddenly started crying on the second grade bus, which often stalled. And the next day we had a substitute teacher who said that rhinos have poor eyesight and swivel their tube-shaped ears in all directions so they can hear their enemies approaching, lions and people who carve their horns into daggers or mash them into pain relievers. My parents bought my shoes on discount at Walensky and Levy, and so whenever I raised either foot, my soul said, damaged. That's why I kept my feet close to the floor. When Mrs. Mulvihill returned, she wore dark dresses and told us that the black rhinoceros is the same muddy color as the white rhinoceros, which is strange if you think about it, and we did. What does it feel like to have two horns tilting up on a huge head, Mr. Rhinoceros? You lumber around in your skin of armor like an exiled general or a grounded unicorn. Everyone knows that a pachyderm in peril would still rather live in the open savanna. We can't tell if you're trumpeting forward or backward in your scrubby house. Cotton candy. We walked on the bridge over the Chicago River for what turned out to be the last time, and I ate cotton candy, that sugary air, that sweet blue light spun out of nothingness. It was just a moment, really, nothing more. But I remember marveling at the sturdy cables of the bridge that held us up, and threading my fingers to the long and slender fingers of my grandfather, an old man from the old world who long ago disappeared into the nether regions. And I remember that 8-year-old boy who had tasted the sweetness of air, which still clings to my mouth and disappears when I breathe. This is called Branch Library. I'm trying in this poem to get to the feeling I had when I first started writing poetry when I was in high school and I was moving at the library between the stacks where I was reading and the tables where I was writing. I wish I could find that skinny, long-beaked boy who perched in the branches of the old Branch Library. He spent the Sabbath flying between the wobbly stacks and the flimsy wooden tables on the second floor, pecking at nuts, nesting in broken spines, scratching notes under his own corner patch of sky. I'd give anything to find that birdie boy again, bursting out into the dusky blue afternoon with his satchel of scrawls and scribbles, radiating heat, singing with joy. Self-portrait. I lived between my heart and my head, like a married couple who can't get along. I lived between my left arm, which is swift and sinister, and my right, which is righteous. I lived between a laugh and a scowl, and voted against myself, a two-party system. My left leg dawdled or danced along, my right cleaved to the straight and narrow. My left shoulder was like a stripper on vacation. My right stood upright as a Roman soldier. Let's just say that my left side was the organ donor and leave my private parts alone. But as for my eyes, which are 2 shades of brown, well, Dionysus, meet Apollo. Look at Eve raising her left eyebrow while Adam puts his right foot down. No one expected it to survive, but divorce seemed out of the question. I suppose my left hand and my right hand will be clasped over my chest in the coffin, and I'll be reconciled at last. I'll be whole again. This is called A Partial History of My Stupidity. You get to be a certain age, you just can't do the whole thing anymore. So this is only part. This is like volume 3, chapter 5. Traffic was heavy coming off the bridge, and I took the road to the right, the wrong one, and got stuck in the car for hours. Most nights I rushed out into the evening without paying attention to the trees, whose names I didn't know, or the birds, which flew heedlessly on. I couldn't relinquish my desires or accept them, and so I strolled along like a tiger that wanted to spring, but was still afraid of the wildness within. The iron bars seemed invisible to others, but I carried a cage around inside me. I cared too much what other people thought and made remarks I shouldn't have made. I was silent when I should have spoken. Forgive me, philosophers. I read the Stoics, but never understood them. I felt that I was living the wrong life, spiritually speaking. while halfway around the world, thousands of people were being slaughtered, some of them by my countrymen. So I walked on, distracted, lost in thought, and forgot to attend to those who suffered far away, nearby. Forgive me, faith, for never having any. I did not believe in God, who eluded me. This is called Troubadour Song. I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and hummed a song for nothing, how nothing came to me. I dreamed I mounted a horse along an empty beach where we galloped far away till I was out of reach. We trotted past the lighthouse abandoned on the dunes and paused by a small stable that was now in ruins. I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and made a song for nothing, how nothing came to me. We rode to the starkest edge of nowhere by the sea. The horse was all that remained of what I'd longed to be. We had somewhere deep to rest and nothing left to see, and so the two of us walked into the cemetery. I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and sang a song for nothing, how nothing came to me. This is called God and Me. The stars look like a broken belt glittering over the lakes and mountains. The moon looks like a tilted crown. Down here, there's a whole lot of racket in churches and bedrooms. Some good folks are speaking in tongues and raising the rafters. I wonder if the Lord ever gets tired of so much flattery from the fundamentalists. He probably likes it better than all the complaints and entreaties. I'm standing up to listen, but he has nothing to say to the atheists. It would be nice to believe that heaven is like a schoolyard in which everyone gets chosen, even the laggards. My friends are seekers and exiles who won't desert the stories. Me, I can't give him up, but I can't believe in him either. It's a one-sided relationship, I without thou. He has whole galaxies to worry about. I don't suppose he gets too worked up. My puny self is more real to me than his immense non-being. I'm a tiny void with attributes, with my own little river of tears. But what is he who fills the world with trees and stars and leaves us alone with our wars and atrocities, our deadly human nature, our sad dominion over the fish and the fowl? Look, no one knows why there's so much silence in the upper spheres and so much suffering down here. The Almighty skipped over our houses. I'm going to read you two more poems. This is called Variations on a Psalm. The psalm is number 72. The section is 2. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night, I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. And I would not be comforted when I was in distress. I sought the Lord. I did not know why I did not believe, while I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted in my distress. I sought the Lord. I would not pray. I would not call on him, stretched out with my untiring hands, and comforted I would not be when I was in distress. Without the Lord, I stretched out tireless on the bed. My hands were sleepless in despair, and I would not be comforted in my distress. I sought the Lord. I could not find him. At night I stretched out untiring hands like a penitent, O Lord of disbelief, and I would not be comforted. I was never able to pray. Wheel me down to the shore where the lighthouse was abandoned and the moon tolls in the rafters. Let me hear the wind paging through the trees and see the stars flaring out one by one like the forgotten faces of the dead. I was never able to pray. But let me inscribe my name in the book of waves, under a dome of sky that never ends, and see my voice sail into the night. Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you. So let's talk about poetry.
Yeah. Where do you want to start?
What's the difference when people, so everyone's here and you come to a poetry reading. What's the difference when they hear us read than when they go home, which they're definitely going to do tonight, and buy our books and go and read them at home? So there's a different experience. What is that?
Well, it's interesting. Like last night in class, I was teaching James Merrill's The Book of Ephraim, or discussing this with an MFA class, and a lot of people in the room were admiring the poem but having trouble with it. It's a dense poem. It's a difficult poem, and I remembered that I had a couple of sections from the poem on my iPad that were from a reading that Merrill recorded at Harvard. And after I played those, suddenly the class came alive in the way that it wasn't before that, because people were hearing, as you sometimes do in the workshop when you hear a poem read aloud, like you hear what the intention of the writer was, that wasn't necessarily visible on the page. But I'm often struck by, there obviously was a period, basically I think just before both of us were born, when there really weren't a lot of poetry readings. People might only go to a poetry reading a couple of times in their life, and there's that
poetry reading as a phenomena was really developed in the United States by Dylan Thomas.
But by Dylan Thomas, and then the Beats later.
And then the rise of the writing program.
Yeah, but there's that great story of Robert Lowell finding himself on a reading tour in the West with Allen Ginsberg, and realizing that he needed to put these poems across to an audience. So he started dropping words and rewriting the poems and thinking a little bit more about the audience. But I'm also thinking about St. Augustine's Confessions, that has Augustine sees Ambrose reading silently to himself, and as far as I know, that's the first moment in literature in which someone is reading silently rather than reading aloud. And in the scheme of things, that wasn't actually all that long ago.
So, in the history of poetry, people heard Homer and Homeric singers singing epics, that epics were not a written form, they were an oral form. But there's a tremendous difference between the audiences who would go and hear Homer sing versus people would, Sappho was probably the first poet to write poems down where people could actually read them. Mm-hmm. And so that's a different experience. Reading is a different experience than hearing an epic, say, or a lyric. One, you can keep the lyric in your mind. And two, so some Homeric singer is singing you the story of the Iliad, and you go, God, that simile is so complicated, I'd like to think about it. You can't. You don't have time. The story's going on. People are going to be killing each other in another moment. You don't have time to stop and think about the Homeric simile the way you do in freshman English in college. The Homeric simile is meant to be experienced as an oral thing. But when you read the lyric poem of Sappho, I'm not saying you shouldn't hear it read aloud, though no one knows how those actually sounded. When Sappho takes the word bitter and the word sweet and puts them together, sweet bitter, and puts it with Eros, so it's Eros the bittersweet or Eros the sweet bitter, she makes a concept that we didn't know before, that love was either sweet or love was bitter, but we all recognize bittersweetness as a phenomenon or a feeling. When you're reading a poem, you can actually think about that. And you can think about love as a bittersweet thing. And so I think that the written lyric creates a space for interiority for you that the oral poem doesn't. So the oral poem gives you a kind of physical presence of the speaker and the singer, and that gives you something tremendous to help sometimes clarify a poem, but it doesn't give you much time to reflect. Whereas the written poem that you experience on your own, when you read it, does give you time to reflect, and it gives you another kind of interior experience that you wouldn't have.
Well, and I think there's also a way in which I think, and I'm not the first person to say this, that in a way, the Renaissance lyric invented the inner life in the way that we understand it today, like in Shakespeare's sonnets or John Donne's poems or Herbert's poems. That the interiority that's in those poems is very much the same interiority of Freud in the early 20th century.
I once proposed to Robert Pinsky, who, that sounds funny. I didn't propose to Robert. I didn't actually propose to
Like that's
Robert
the
Pinsky.
value of punctuation,
Yes,
right?
yes. I didn't propose to him. He was already married. I don't think he would have taken it well. But no, he was a big advocate at the time. He was a big advocate for poems being read aloud, and I was advocating for reading them to yourself. And I proposed we have an event in which he read poems aloud, and I stood up there and read them to myself to make a point. But he didn't.
So this never happened, or it wasn't successful?
It didn't succeed. I couldn't convince him to do it. But I'm serious about the experience that I'm talking about, that it creates, so the relationship I have with you right now and that Robert has with you from a poetry reading creates one kind of relationship with a group of people that help bring us together. But when you're reading a poem on your own, it creates another kind of experience. And I think that reading creates a kind of relationship that audiences do not, and that the relationship is one-to-one, and that poems are necessarily social because they're in language, and language belongs to everyone. But because of the intensity of the lyric and because of its interiority, they're also private. And I think poems also speak to our interior lives. And I personally believe that poetry delivers on our spiritual lives because it gives us the gift of privacy and participation. It gives us interiority, but it also gives us community with another person. And so that's a kind of relationship. You're not alone with your own feelings. You're alone with your own feelings and the words of another. And that's an experience of reading that you can't get in an...
Oh, I would agree with that aspect totally, because I mean, I think one of the ways in which I think poetry works is it's communication with the great dead. While you're reading them, and you have this voice in your head. I mean, you mentioned Dylan Thomas before. I mean, do you think Dylan Thomas was someone whose work was actually kind of damaged by how effectively he could read his poetry aloud?
Well,
that famous kind of Donald Hall essay in which you can take lines from almost any Dylan Thomas poem and move them to another Dylan Thomas poem, and they work exactly as well.
I mean, the language is ahead of the thought in Dylan Thomas, and sometimes he doesn't seem to know what he's saying, and the ideas don't seem tremendously complicated. They seem to be, in our death is our birth, in our birth is our death, womb and doom seems to be a kind of Dylan Thomas thing. But there's also a Welsh tradition that he was drawing on of certain kinds of sounds in poetry, and I think he was hearing that. I mean, I think that the readings probably did theatricalize his experience, and we both know poets who write poems so that they can be read aloud at readings. It seems a bit catastrophic to me to do that, but Thomas, the success of hearing it and the power of the readings when you hear them on recording is absolutely tremendous. But it may have been that was the kind of poet he was going to be anyway, because of the way he heard Welsh sounds, because of the tremendous orality of the work, because there's not a tremendous amount of thinking in that poetry anyway. It's all the music is so ahead of the thought in that particular, in his particular case. Hart Crane is a little like that too, where you go, the words are just, the sound of the words is driving the thing much more than the actual cognition. Are these your favorite poets? I mean, do you like poets like that the most?
Like Dylan Thomas?
Yeah.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, that's why I said, that's why I asked
Yeah.
why I asked you the question that way. I mean, I think I remember listening to a teacher once explain, that lyric poems were poems that were once written to be sung, and then by the Renaissance, it was exactly the opposite. There were poems that couldn't be sung because of the level of complexity. But, like I recently heard, you mentioned Robert Pinsky, like Robert Pinsky do one of his poem jazz performances that he does. And he not only, kind of performs his own poems, he performs, poems by poets that he loves. And he did some earlier poems that were, George Herbert poems. He did a Ben Jonson poem. He did a Robert Frost poem. And what I was struck by, I mean, like one of the poems, I'm not sure whether it's a poem that I'm not sure whether this was the poem, in fact, but I was thinking of it was a poem that was in one sentence long, like George Herbert's Prayer or the Silken Tent poem or something like that. And there was something so powerful about listening to a voice hold that single sentence in front of you as a unit that I actually find harder to reproduce on the page when I'm reading silently to myself.
Well, Frost said that whenever he saw a poem, he'd run down a poem that rhymed, he'd run down the right-hand side to see who won, the poet or the rhyme scheme.
Yeah.
And that's funny, and it also tells you something that you get in reading that you don't quite get when you, because, I mean, Silken Tent is a marvelous poem.
Yeah.
But the enjambments, because it's one sentence rhyming sonnet, the enjambments are so powerful you can't quite hesitate on the rhymes.
Yeah.
And when you read the poem you and see it at the same time, you can see the rhymes and you see it's even more clever, really.
And there's some work that actually just can't be read aloud. I
Yeah.
mean, like I think of like some Gertrude Stein.
Or Marianne Moore.
Yeah, Marianne Moore, in which like in Stein's case anyways, like this verb is the last word of the first part of the sentence and the first part of the next part of the sentence. And you have to make a decision about how you're going to read that aloud because you can't read it both ways simultaneously. Yeah.
I mean, that's something that's something that writing does that orality can't do. I mean, orality does give you something that writing can't do.
Yeah.
And it gives you a kind of presence and a kind of power, and it can overwhelm you in a way, in a certain kind of way. But that's what it does.
Do you read your poems aloud when you're writing them?
I would say, I can't remember who said it, but I picked up something called about where someone referred to the inner ear. And so, I mean, I look sort of, I often am like sitting in some place, in some fast food place with some other homeless people, and we're doing the same thing, basically. We're talking to ourselves, basically.
Yeah.
And we look the same, too. I'm not giving it a full-fledged reading, but I am trying to hear what it will sound like. I don't know if you are, but I'm like trying to hear the words to myself and saying them over again to hear.
Yeah, there's always a stage, and it's often a stage when I'm stuck, actually.
Yeah, try and hear what it will.
Yeah.
Try and hear what
Where
it
it
will
could
do
go.
and what it might do to see if it will get you somewhere. Because often your consciousness is interfering. It's repressive to something you want to write, and so you're trying to get to see where the poem is trying to take you, beyond what you're letting it do, and you just see if the form or the words will guide you or lead you to something that you can't get to otherwise.
Do you have any interest in performative poetry, spoken word, or?
I wouldn't say I have no interest in it, because it has such a long history, and I wrote this book called The Poet's Glossary.
It's an amazing book. Everyone here should run out.
Anyway,
and
it's
buy it
all
right
the
now.
poetry. It's all the poetry terms. It's an encyclopedia or a dictionary, and doing the research for it shocked me many ways. And one of the things that it shocked me about was I like to think of poetry as a non-competitive activity. I mean, it didn't even occur to me that it was really competitive activity. But in the history of poetry does not bear that out. The history of poetry suggests that almost every oral culture has poetry competitions, and those are oral. And they're folk competitions or they're high elite competitions like the troubadour poets, and sometimes they're bat downs like when black kids play the dozens where they insult each other with rhyme, and sometimes it's the troubadours where one poet sings a poem in a form and another poet repeats the same form and goes back and forth. But nonetheless, these competitions are oral, and they go very far back in Chinese poetry and Egyptian poetry and Arabic poetry and English poetry. I mean, there's just no way around this thing of the competitiveness of oral poetry. So poetry slams, poetry competitions, spoken word poetry has a long history of, improvisation, poetry on the spot, poetry that's dramatic or melodramatic. And so I can't say it's so important to the history of poetry that you'd have to say it has some interest. Most of the poems themselves seem conventional to me. The content seems so overworked, so driven. It's as if everyone had said, okay, everybody, we're only going to write Petrarchan sonnets from now on. Most spoken word poems are just completely conventional to me in terms of the content. But the delivery, that's interesting.
Yeah, when I was in Chicago, I worked closely with Young Chicago Authors, which I think is one of the great spoken word organizations. And
What started there?
yeah, at the Green Mill.
Green Mill, yeah.
And I got to judge their
Yeah.
contest
Yeah.
twice, and I found it actually an incredibly moving experience. And one of the things I did when I was at the foundation is that I brought together the National Student Poets, which come out of Scholastic magazine, and they write poems for the page, and brought them together with some spoken word organizations, but also brought them together with this program that the foundation had called Poetry Out Loud, in which people recite poems by other people. And what was extraordinary is that when you had these 15 young people in the same room, after about 5 minutes, you couldn't tell which group anyone kind of belonged to. The National Student Poets saw what the spoken word poets were doing, so they realized that they actually had to read their poems better than they had thought that they should do. And not only did the Poetry Out Loud students start reading their poems by Robert Frost or Keats or Gwendolyn Brooks as if they were spoken word, they also read their own poems. And I think for people under a certain age, these things are all along a kind of continuum.
Yes, but maybe you had a different experience than I, but my experience is that the influence is one way, that the spoken word poets influence younger page poets, which is what they call me. I didn't know there was such a obsolete genre, but they call us page poets. But the young poets who write for the page, most of the ones I teach or know, are influenced by spoken word poetry. But spoken word poetry is not influenced very much by page poetry.
I think, but that was one of the discoveries. I think it increasingly kind of is, because I think a lot of the spoken word poets are interested in publishing books, in writing books. And
once you get interested in publishing a book, then you have to get interested in how that happens.
And this day in Chicago ended with all of them reading in a kind of round robin, Carl Sandburg, Chicago, and it was terrific.
Too bad it's not a better poem.
No, I know.
Much to my dismay, because I'm from Chicago, so I had to read it my whole life. Heavy burden, but we had to carry it.
You're in New York, so you're safe.
Yeah.
I could listen to you all evening, but there's a clock above our head, and I do want to open this up to the audience. And it was wonderful to hear you both read. Thank you so much. Really,
well, thank you for having me.
Stunning work. And I thought so much in listening to both of you read about the issues that you were speaking about, the relationship between hearing poetry and being able to see it on the page. Because I wanted to, I sort of wanted the subtitles that you get in opera performances, because I wanted to spend more time with the words. And there is a kind of duration, and you're already onto something else, right? Whether it's the battle or you're onto something else. And so then you have to try to reconstruct this, because you're holding on to some fragment of an image that was very, very attractive, and you're trying to unpack that, but you're already now 3 lines further, so you have to kind of move on. And you don't have the luxury of sitting with the book and going back and reading 3 lines 5 times over, because those are the lines that got you. So you wanted to go back. So when you think about writing, Robert, you had asked Ed about this, about whether he's playing it back as he's doing it, right? And you're sitting there homeless-like, mumbling, but sort of doing a kind of playing out in your head of how this might sound. But how much do you think about how people will receive this on the page, right? Do you write it for people to have the amount of time with it, or do you write it to be heard when it's spoken? how does that influence the
I know I
the way
write
you
for
think about
people
writing?
who would have the time,
Yeah.
the time with it, because I mean, most of my poems grow out of fragments that are, are kind of put together in a kind of certain collaged order. And I think what happens when they're read aloud, and that's also deliberate, is that the voice is intended to kind of elide those fragmentary qualities and establish associations among these parts, these pieces in some way.
It's almost in some of your poems that the poem is listening to itself, because the woman says something and then she repeats it.
Yeah, or I've also imagined the title poem of that book is actually, it's in the voice of the book. It's not in the voice of any human speaker. It's the book kind of reflecting on its own processes.
No, it's actually fascinating, and also because in both of the sets of poems that you've read, the sources are remarkably broad, right? So that when you're sort of making a comment about Pegasus or Lost Weekend or film noir, those are also associations that go by quite quickly, and you're trying to peg that. Is he referencing a 1940s film? Is he doing something about street vernacular? Or is it something that's related to mythology? And it's amazing to think about the
But I
kind
was
of
struck when I
collage.
was listening to Ed's poems that I think this is true really of every single poem you read. I mean, they were in some ways about two voices. They were about like a kind of divided self that was kind of moving back and forth.
Well, certainly that poem, Self-Portrait.
Well, the self-portrait, but even like the poem at one point that says, "Oh, there's no I thou," but all the others were kind of I, were kind of I thou, or the two rhinoceros. I mean, they were set up as these kind of almost like dueling internal voices. I mean, it was really remarkable.
I think that in a way, I would say that I'm trying to do both or related to that, so that you would so when someone reads or hears your poem, they have an experience. And the poem itself is a kind of experience. And so you feel something dramatic related to what you've heard. But then the more you looked at the poem, because we read a lot of poems, and you sometimes hear a poem and you go, that's really tremendous, and then you read it and you go, actually, it's not so interesting as when I heard it, what happened. And then you read other poems and you go, that's even better than I thought it was, because you look at the parts and you go, that really holds up. And I think what in poetry I love by other people, and what I aspire to, is that the more you look at the parts, the more you see. So when for example, you experience form on your pulse when you hear it. But when you read it, you not only experience on your pulse, you can actually see how it works. Yeah. And so you can have other kinds of aesthetic pleasures in seeing how the form works out. You can't quite get when you're just hearing it aloud. So you can, so in my poem, like the first, that you're talking about, the first poem I read to poetry, there's a reference to, in the first stanza, to, about the movie, which probably many of you know, about a writer who doesn't write, he just gets drunk all the time. And that's The Lost Weekend. I thought it was funny. Yeah. I mean, I thought my joke was funny, which is, forgive me for not writing poetry this weekend, I was watching The Lost Weekend, which is about a writer not writing because he's getting drunk. But you don't have much time to explain that. You're going on to something else. Right. And there's a stanza in that poem where all of the things in the stanza are different definitions of poetry that people had. So stored magic, that was Robert Graves' idea of poetry, which what he meant by that is a poem is a form of stored magic, which it means it goes on sometimes for centuries, and then when you read it, the magic is released. Or secret code, or indifferent entity. There's Gavin Douglas, a 16th century Scottish poet, called poetry pleasance and half wonder, which I really like. All of that stanza is definitions of poetry. Yeah. But when you're hearing it, you sort of know that, but you can't stop on any one of those and figure out what that is, because it's all one sentence and the poem is going on.
And why don't we open up now, as we're going on, for questions for Robert Polito or Ed Hirsch. Yeah, please, and speak loudly because we don't have mics back there.
Sure. You spoke about You mentioned a poem that could not be read, the possibility of that type of poem. What about the possibility of a poem that could not be written? For example, Alvin Lucier's I'm Sitting in a Room. I think of that in my mind as a very powerful expression, a poetic expression. And it exists as a piece. It exists as a temporal object. So, thoughts on that?
I guess I said that about Gertrude Stein, but I don't know. I could write that phrase down. I'm not sure what in a way, what the issue is.
Okay.
I mean, what I was thinking about was that, like, one of the great things about reading Stein's poetry or prose is that she was just kind of a genius at constructing these kind of long sentences in which, you know, you really can't tell whether this word goes with this part of the sentence or with the next part of the sentence, because it sort of goes with both, and it's disappointing in a way to read it aloud, because you have to choose between something that's meant to be totally fluid.
But there are poets. I mean, I would say there are poets who approach something that's inexpressible, which is another way to think about what you're saying. I'd say Mallarmé is a poet like
Paul
that,
Celan.
where Paul Celan is where the poems approach a kind. You're talking about something performative, but I think there are also poets who are trying to speak at the edge of silence, and the poems keep alluding to something that they can't say, and they take you as far as they can on a journey towards something that's inexpressible.
And then there's Dada poems that are sounds, and then people have tried to transcribe those sounds.
I mean, there's one side of poetry is just the sound side, is pure sound poetry is related to nonsense poetry, is related to just sounds without any denotation.
Yeah.
So when you write your poetry, do you ever have a moment of thought where you wonder who's the narrator of this poem? Is it me, or is it some third person figure or idea?
All the time. Yeah, all the time. I mean, I think that
Maybe you should repeat the question.
yeah, the question is, do you ever have moments when you wonder who's talking in the poem, who the speaker of the poem is? And most of my poems do start with just lines, with just phrases, and then they build out from there. And they're rarely about me, except obliquely.
I mean, sometimes there are poems that are persona, where you speak in a voice that's clearly not your own. And that's pretty explicit. I mean, you put your own experience in it maybe, but you try and make it as convincing as possible. But in a Browning monologue, the speaker of the dramatic monologue is clearly is meant not to be Robert Browning. It's meant to be someone else. And most poems are on some kind of a scale, I'd say. But even the most personal poem, you're aware that even if you wanted to speak exactly as yourself, whatever that would be, you're not actually able to. And that the voice is always some kind of a construction. It's an approximation of yourself, and often I don't mean to be coy about it, you're speaking about your own personal experience, but you are shaping it, and it is a kind of fictive construction, and sometimes you may not know how much is the fiction and how much is you, but there's a sort of scale from the most fictive, I'd say, to Robert Lowell trying to give the impression that the real Robert Lowell is speaking. But whenever you're involved with art, which you are when you're related to poetry, there is some transmutation, and you are speaking through some kind of a guise that's not exactly yourself.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Robert Lowell. I mean, like in the poem Epilogue, why not say what happened?
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, we're poor passing facts. In the rough draft of that poem, it was we're poor passing things, and a fact is a made object, faccio. I mean, so it's already, turning it into something that's constructed.
Do we have time for one more? Yeah.
I'm struck by a near analogy in the visual arts, where I'm looking at a painting in a museum. The comparison would be perhaps to speaking, reciting, reading a poem, and then one can go home and look at gasp, a reproduction, but have the opportunity for more interiority bones are not aching, one has the comfort of one's own home, and one does not anticipate, the next battle, as you were saying, and which could be a Rubens painting, or Paulo Cello, or a battle is being depicted. So it's art in the age of
Most artists don't like what you're saying.
Yeah.
They are hostile to that idea because they go, you can only experience the painting in front of the painting. But as a literary person, I find that not to be true. I'm with you. That yes, you experience a certain thing because you have the scale and you're in the presence of it. You definitely have a certain kind of experience when you were in front of it that you can't have when you're not. But there's something to be said with sitting home with a good reproduction, thinking about what this damn thing is doing and how it works, and where you're not in the museum with other people, and having some kind of private relationship to it, even though you're aware that now you're looking at a facsimile. Now, that's different than poetry, because there isn't an original in the same
that's what I was
way
gonna say, yeah.
in poetry. But
What
in
is
art
the
there
original of the poem? Yeah.
Well, yeah, Benjamin made a career out of this,
Yeah,
and thinking about the life of the postcard, the reproduction, and how we live with that, and what our relationship is to the original thing, which may be a good place for us to stop at the original thing. This has been actually a wonderful conversation,
Hey,
and
thank you,
so
Mark.
I want to
Thanks,
thank you
everybody.
again.
Thanks,
This has been wonderful. So. Before you all take off, I want you to know that our next conversation is happening here at the New School, November 19th. And we'll be joined by Brian Rose, who's an archaeologist, who's at Penn, Deborah Lair, who's the founder of the Antiquities Coalition, and art historian and director of the Getty, James Cuno. And they'll be discussing cultural patrimony in the post-Mosul era, what the responsibility is of academic institutions, cultural institutions, museums, auction houses in the preservation of cultural artifacts. So please join us here on November 19th, same time, and it'll be great to see you then. Thank you very much.